Hi, my name is Gila Hoch, and I'm the director of the Dr. Beth Samuel's Drisha High School programs, and I'd like to share some of my thoughts with you on Parashat Yitro. Parashat Yitro opens with the story of Yitro and Moshe. What's interesting about this story is that at this moment we've just left Mitzrayim. This is the beginning of the post-slavery era in Jewish history. And this is the first time that we can truly call ourselves a Jewish nation. And Yitro is our first encounter with an individual non-Jew who approaches the Jewish nation. And what's encouraging is that this is actually a very positive encounter. Moshe comes out to meet Yitro when he arrives, and he kisses him and he bows down to him and he invites him into his tent. And then Moshe, very excited, almost like a kid coming back from school, excited to tell his parents about his first day at school, tells Yitro all the amazing, incredible miracles that God had done for them in the past little while. And Yitro responds accordingly and says, the Torah tells us, Vayichad Yitro. He was very pleased to hear all of this, and even goes so far as to make a holiday in recognition of the miracles that God had done. That Yitro then goes and brings sacrifices to God, and has a festive meal for Moshe and Aharon and his Kenim. Then the story continues where Yitro sees that Moshe is having trouble managing all the legal affairs of the nation, and offers his advice, saying that Moshe needs to have a judicial system in place and can't expect to deal with all these cases on his own. And Moshe listens to him, almost word for word. Yitro gives his advice, and as the Torah relates to us, Moshe's putting all that advice in place. It's almost the exact same wording that Yitro had used, showing that Moshe really heard what Yitro had to say and accepted it, and listened to him. And then Yitro goes on his way. This is really there's a very positive interaction here between Yitro and Moshe, where they're both able to learn one from the other, and really seem to respect each other. However, if we take a step back, the previous story in the Torah, from last week's parasha, is the story of Amalek, which is in fact perhaps one of the most negative interactions that we have as a Jewish nation with another nation, where Amalek comes and attacks us as we're leaving Mitzrayim. And then the story ends with God telling Moshe, Ki macho emcha et zecher Amalek. I'm going to wipe out the name of Amalek from the world. Even just the mention of Amalek will not occur in the world. And it's very interesting that these two stories come one right after the other, that we have this incredibly negative story of Amalek, and then this very nice positive meeting between Yitro and Moshe. And the Midrash itself also saw this parallel between Yitro and Amalek, praising Yitro's actions, in contrast to those of Amalek. And of course we know that Esav, being the forefather of the nation of Amalek, so the Midrash actually draws some of those parallels between Yitro and Esav, and then later on between Yitro and Amalek. So for example, Esav is accused of having stopped korbanot, of not allowing korbanot to be brought, whereas Yitro in fact brought his own korbanot, he brought his own sacrifices to God, in recognition of the miracles that were done in Mitzrayim. And the Midrash later then continues, a little bit later, and says and tells us this story that actually Yitro and Amalek not only do they appear next to each other in the Torah, but they actually knew each other, and they were both advisors to Paro while he was enslaving the Israelites. And after the Exodus, Amalek then goes and attacks the nation, and are wiped out. And Yitro sees that they were wiped out, repents, and comes and meets Moshe in peace. Now this last piece of the Midrash really emphasizes to us this crucial juncture that the nation was at. We've now left Mitzrayim, we're this new nation, and we have to ask ourselves, what exactly does that mean? Who are we? What is our place in this global community in the ranks of the other nations? Until this point, we've had incredibly negative interactions with others. We were always the oppressed. For 400 years, we were the ones oppressed in Mitzrayim, and our entire purpose in life was simply to survive, survive that slavery. As soon as we left, again, we were attacked again by Amalek, just further emphasizing to us that we needed to shield ourselves and protect ourselves, and we weren't able to have any positive communication with the outside, with other nations. But then we have this story of Yitro, and suddenly we see that, in fact, we can be a respected member of the nations of the world, and others do see the positive in us, and we can have that back and forth with them. I think even the Torah itself, even in the language, draws this parallel between Amalek and Yitro. That the story of Amalek opens with the verbs of Vayavo Amalek, that Amalek comes out to meet the Jewish nation, and Moshe says to Yoshua, V'tzei hilachem, and go out and fight with them. So Amalek and Yoshua are meeting in the middle. And the same thing happens with Yitro, that the Torah tells us Vayavo Yitro, that Yitro comes, and two psukim later, Vayetzei Moshe comes out to meet him. Again, it's kind of a meeting in the middle. Emphasize I think that the Torah, that the use of those verbs simply shows us that indeed these are important interactions that are happening of a meeting between two cultures, between two nations. To take this one step further, this comparison between Amalek and Yitro, interestingly, Moshe seems to learn a similar lesson in each one. In the story of Amalek, as the war goes on, Moshe tells Yoshua that he will raise his hands if the nation is doing well, and lower his hands if the nation is doing poorly. And the Torah tells us that at a certain point during the war, in Parak Yud Zayin, Pasuk Yud Bet, the Torah tells us, V'idei Moshe kvedim, Moshe's hands became heavy, and they had to come and help support him. V'Aharon v'Chor tamchu biyadav, so Aharon and Chor come and support his hands. Mizeh echad u'mizeh echad, and they come and help him out and hold up his hands because they had become too heavy for him. Similarly, in Yitro, that same language of kaved is used in relation to Moshe. When Yitro comes and gives his advice to Moshe, he says to him in Parak Yud Chet, Pasuk Yud Chet, he says, Moshe, you're not going to be able to continue like this. Ki chaved mimcha hadavar. This is too heavy for you. Again, that language of heavy, this time in a metaphorical sense. But again, Moshe, you're not going to be able to do this. This burden is too heavy for you. Lo tuchal asahu levadecha. You're not going to be able to do it on your own. You need to go out and appoint other judges in order to help you out here. Again, Moshe is learning here that he's not going to be able to do it all on his own. He's not going to be able to do this by himself. There needs to be a structure, there needs to be a government, there needs to be a support system for him. Moshe is no longer acting as simply God's vehicle of performing miracles for Mitzrayim, but rather he's now the leader of a nation, which is an entirely different role, and he can no longer act alone, because he's no longer acting on a daily basis, he's no longer simply enacting God's miracles in the world on a daily basis. Rather, he's become the leader now. He's the one who is controlling it, and he needs to be able to set up this system for the nation. I think that this juxtaposition between Amalek and Yitro, this learning about how to interact with the outside world, and Moshe's own lesson about the structure of his community, is relevant still for us today. That this model set up for us is that on the one hand, we must always be looking at our external interactions with other nations, with other cultures, and asking ourselves what beyond the Jewish community is our role. What is our role in the global community? Where we see that it can go either way. It can go in the negative way of Amalek or in the positive way of Yitro. And it's very important that we're always working on those interactions. At the same time, those interactions are not going to be successful, and we will not be able to be a respected member of the global community if we're not also looking at ourselves. If we're not learning the lesson of Moshe ki chaved mimcha, if we don't have a system in place, if we don't have our own infrastructure. And it's important that in order to enable ourselves to be a part of that global community, in order to look out, we need to also constantly be looking in and examining ourselves and how does our own community function, and are we doing the best we can for our own community in order that we'll be a strong unit, a nation who can then impact the rest of the world. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.